Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Chris Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And if you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can follow me on YouTube. I'm on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM, Podbean, a whole bunch of other podcatchers. And, of course, I am rebroadcast later on Friday nights from, I believe it's 10 to midnight, although I should probably double-check that, on a host of other networks, including Awake Radio, People's Internet Radio, PSN, Ed Opperman's Spreaker channel, and a few others as well. Well, I want to welcome all the listeners back and apologize for my somewhat summer hiatus. I know I was off for a couple of weeks from the show, but I am back now. I'm done with my summer vacation, which was quite enjoyable. But I did miss talking with all of you, so thank you for putting up with the sort of the absence of some new shows. I do want to just point out that there was lots of great material up on the website, including a really great interview I did with J.G. Michael for Parallax Views. It was a two-part show we did on Jeffrey Epstein, and it's a really great interview. Highly recommend that. There's lots of other stuff as well. I think I'll talk a little bit more about that in the second hour. But in the first hour, we are joined once again by a good friend and repeat guest journalist, Keelan Balderson from wideshut.co.uk. We're going to be talking about a new remastered documentary that Keelan did called the Chris Benoit Files, which you can find at WrestlePundit.com. It's been a while since I've been live on the air, I guess. But Keelan, how are you? It's good to be talking with you.
Good, man. Good to be back.
Excellent. Well, I guess I'll say this is definitely a departure from our usual topics of conversation. Keelan, you and I usually discuss terrorism, a lot of interesting jihadi groups linked to MI6 and others. We've spoken about Tommy Robinson and the rise of the right-wing groups within the United Kingdom. But we're totally switching gears a bit, talking about the former pro wrestler Chris Benoit, who was involved in a very brutal murder-suicide where he killed his wife, Nancy, his 7 or 8 year old son, Daniel, and then hung himself on some gym equipment. And this is, like I said, quite a departure. But I was happy to see that you were tweeting about the Chris Benoit Files, this documentary series that you did a few years back now for WrestlePundit.com, and you recently put it all together. And it is timely because I'm sure many of the listeners didn't know, but earlier in I believe it was June 24th marked the 10-year anniversary since Chris Benoit took his own life and the lives of his wife and son. So very interesting topic. There's a lot actually to unpack with all of this, and there is a much larger issue dealing with concussions and brain damage that we're going to get to later. But Keelan, I guess first and foremost, what made you make this film on Chris Benoit, and tell us a little bit about WrestlePundit.com.
Yeah, well, I've always been a pro wrestling fan, and actually I was sort of doing blogs and working for wrestling news sites before I even started anything with Wide Shut. And at the time that this happened back in 2007, as I say, I was kind of doing some of the wrestling news So I did get to cover this, not firsthand as such, but I was sifting through the information and putting out updates on a few of the sites and stuff. And it's a brutal story, a fascinating story. But I kind of left it alone at that point. I thought, look, everything's out there. You know, there's nothing else really to go on with this. But about 6 or 7 years after that, I realized we've kind of got a whole generation of new fans to pro wrestling that don't really know what happened. And because the company WWE have it as a policy not to ever talk about the guy, he's kind of been brushed under the rug. And this void was kind of left where it got filled with a lot of sort of conspiracy theories, things like Kevin Sullivan, who was a wrestler who at one point sort of played a satanic gimmick. Oh, he did it because he divorced Chris's wife and things like that. A lot of the mainstream media kind of focused on steroids. So I thought, well, you know, I'll put something together. Started as a podcast, and then I quickly turned it into a video series. And then just recently, I mean, I did that in 2013, but just recently I put it all together into one file, and it seems to have been spread quite widely.
No, and it's an excellent documentary, especially in the full, you know, I believe it was like 5 parts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's nice to have it all together as, you know, one thing. It's about an hour long. Really good stuff. And I mean, full disclosure, I grew up a massive wrestling fan. And actually, you know, at the time when I was really into wrestling, I hated Chris Benoit. I thought he was, you know, super creepy and scary. I never liked him. And, you know, and then I sort of just stopped following wrestling. And then I remember when this all happened, it, you know, it was like came rushing back to me. And it's interesting you were just mentioning there, this whole new generation. You know, I mean, wrestling now is more popular than it's ever been. It's like a massive following. Actually, a ton of my friends started following it fairly recently and are super into it. And actually, I have a good friend who works for WWE as well, mainly on the marketing side. You know, not involved in the wrestling or anything like that. But so I've seen some recent pay-per-views. I haven't gone, but I've had chances to go to some of the live shows and stuff like that. And it's crazy, like the level to which it's sort of gone right now, where it is. It's like one of the, you know, the most watched shows on Mondays and Thursdays. You've got more and more, like people like Ronda Rousey entering into the world of wrestling. And as you said, Keelan, the entire history of Benoit has been essentially, I mean, it's not even like whitewashed. It's like it never even happened. He like doesn't exist in this world. There's no mention of him. And, for people that, you know, are unaware, and we'll get to it a bit later, I mean, wrestling, the amount of deaths in wrestling is staggering when you compare it to professional sports or just entertainment in general. The amount of people within the wrestling community that are dying either of, like, you know, crazy things like murder, but suicide, drug overdose. There's a whole myriad of health problems and stuff. So there is this like kind of darker side to all of this, and we'll explore that. But I guess, Keelan, for the listeners out there that may be unfamiliar, explain what transpired back on June 24th. This is a crime that actually took place over several days. I believe it's 3 days in total. But give the listeners an idea of what happened.
So Chris Benoit, obviously, wrestling's a pretty grueling schedule. They barely get any time off. And he was scheduled for a live event, I think, it would have been both on the Friday and the Saturday. And he no-showed those events. So there was already kind of, you know, where is this guy? Because Chris Benoit was one of those people that he didn't miss events. He was very loyal, almost prided himself on kind of his in-ring work and the dedication that he gave to this. And he missed those shows. And basically over the span of 3 days, he murdered his wife to start with on the Friday, or at least, the timeline's not exact, but it spanned over 3 days. He killed his wife first. She was bound and basically asphyxiated. Then he sedated his young son with, I think, like an opiate, and then smothered him in his sleep. And then, as you said at the start there, he hung himself on some weight equipment. I think he actually set it up so it would actually break his neck.
Yeah.
And then hung himself that way. And, there you go. And it's pretty shocking stuff, really. But that's the nutshell of what happened.
Very brutal. A lot of bizarre, like the coverage of it became even more sensational. I think we'll talk about it a little bit later on. But a lot of misreporting, a lot of bogus stories. These crazy stories like that Benoit used his wrestling move, his signature move on his son, which you debunk entirely in the documentary in the Chris Benoit Files. How it doesn't even make sense. The reporting of it is like they had to know it was false, but they were running with the story anyway. And that is like a theme that kind of goes on throughout with the media coverage. And I didn't really know this until I was watching your film, Keelan, but Fox News was obsessed with this. It seems like Hannity was talking about this case every other night. Geraldo was obsessed with this. Very interesting. The outlets that picked this up, but I wanted to, there's two, very widespread conspiracy theories that if, anyone is somewhat familiar with this, they're probably familiar with these two things. And I just wanted to tackle them early on, and then we'll really kind of get into the heart of this. But talk about the mysterious Wikipedia entry, and also about Kevin, the Satanist Sullivan.
Right, yeah. So with Wikipedia, what happened was, somebody edited Chris Benoit's Wikipedia page on the Sunday evening into the sort of early hours of Monday. And so there was a big pay-per-view event on the Sunday that he was supposed to appear at. That's the day that he hung himself. And somehow somebody managed to edit Wikipedia and said Chris Benoit missed the Vengeance pay-per-view due to the death of his wife. And obviously on the face of that, that's wow. How did somebody figure this out, or did they know in advance, or whatever? But when you dig a little deeper, it's just one of those sort of conspiracy side roads that people go down. It turns out that he'd already informed the company that his family had food poisoning. So this kind of, I guess maybe he was going for a cover story at one point and went that way with it. But he did inform the WWE management that his family was sick. They were in the hospital. And when somebody who's a big star no-shows a pay-per-view event, there's always a lot of speculation online. The websites will obviously cover it. Anyone who's watching the pay-per-view will have seen that he didn't show up and would be online discussing it. And this guy who edited this page did go back onto Wiki News and said, look, sorry for doing this. I didn't realize, after this all came out, I didn't really realize what I was doing. I was just reading some speculation, and I went up and changed this information. There's no reason why I did it. And actually, if you go back through this guy's Wikipedia history, he kind of had a track record of messing about with wrestlers' pages, just adding nonsense to them. So it's not really beyond the realm for him to just come up with something random like that and kind of a third hitting the spot, but not really. I mean, if we want to say if this guy was actually involved in the crimes and it was some kind of conspiracy or whatever, why would he go on Wikipedia and reveal that? Why
didn't he talk about Daniel being murdered?
Right, yeah, he didn't even get all the information correct. So, and the police did take him in. They seized his computer. They had a look. He didn't have any links to the Benoit family. He didn't sort of talk with anyone about this. It was just sort of a random thing that he decided to do after watching the event. And I mean, I'm happy with that. I mean, other people might think it's a bit peculiar. It is a little bit weird, but It's just one of those things. If you haven't got anything extra to add to that, then what really does it mean?
Yeah, exactly. And, right. I mean, I'm sure people will, tell us that we're totally wrong, but, there's nothing else to it, like you said. And if there isn't, then you kind of just have to move on.
I mean, it's very possible that at that time, somebody, I don't know, like a Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer, did get some kind of information. Oh, Benoit wasn't there because his wife was sick, and that might have filtered through the wrestling sites and whatever. I've not confirmed that actually happened, but that stuff does happen. So,
that was my sense, that this was really just rumors, because he had up until this point, he'd also told another wrestler and close friend of his, Chavo Guerrero. He actually spoke on the phone with Guerrero probably after he had murdered at least Nancy, and he stated that he had a rough weekend, that they had food poisoning, he was in the hospital. So he could have mentioned that to someone who I mean, people gossip. It is at the end of the day, this is entertainment. People gossip in entertainment, so it's not inconceivable that this kid hears a rumor. There's also the whole Kevin the Satanist Sullivan, and I don't even want to go too far into this. This was a wrestler who was, part of this sort of Satanist wrestling, crew in the 1980s. Nancy Benoit was a member of this, and, people have speculated that he killed, the three of them and made it look like a murder-suicide because, I don't know, a few decades earlier, she had left him for Chris Benoit, which is kind of crazy to hold a grudge for that long. But maybe we can skip a lot of the specifics here, by just sort of jumping to who is the guy that is actually promoting this theory? Because when you reveal who the hell Johnny Angel is, it kind of just makes you really question anyone that buys into this theory. So who is Johnny Angel, the guy that is propagating this theory?
Yeah, it is quite funny. Like when you trace back most of this Chris Benoit conspiracy theory stuff, it goes back to this guy's website, this guy called Johnny Angel. His real name is Johnny Lee Clary. He was a wrestler, but I use that term lightly, like he had the shortest, most insignificant career possible. Yeah. Even if there's websites that track every single match that ever happened, and he's not even on any of that. So he's just sort of like this random guy that maybe wrestled a couple of times. And he never actually met Kevin Sullivan, who was married to Nancy at one time. He never met them. He doesn't know them personally. He just wrote this sort of short, superficial blog really saying that, an inside source told me that Kevin Sullivan is a high-ranking member of the Satanic Church, and he did this because he wanted his revenge. And it's like, well, if you mean the Satanic Church as in, Anton LaVey, then that's, who cares? Like that's not, then they don't sacrifice people. It's just a sort of, it's just a version of atheism that trolls Christians, really. It's not, it's not like it's not a banned group. It's not a criminal group. Nothing's ever really been linked to them. So who cares if he was a high-ranking member of the Satanic Church? But he himself denies that he is. And when you go look at his gimmick from the 80s, I mean, it was a thoroughly entertaining gimmick, probably a bit ahead of its time, to be honest. I mean, it was darker then than what he did in the 90s. But it wasn't, there was no consistency to it. He wasn't following like a written satanic doctrine or anything. He was just pulling sort of tropes from horror films and stuff. So to use that as evidence that he's a Satanist is a bit daft, really. But Johnny Angel himself, it's funny because this guy, was a national spokesman for the KKK. And, like throughout the 90s, I mean, he just seems to be one of these people that likes publicity. So like throughout the 90s, he was on all the sort of chat shows being the go-to person for the KKK. And he'd be on like Morton Downey Jr. And they'd throw him off, and he'd be on Oprah Winfrey. And then all of a sudden he sort of has a a crisis of conscience and turns to God, and then loads of schools were booking him for like motivational speaking and just a load of nonsense really. But this is the guy that spread this theory that Kevin Sullivan, the Satanist, killed Chris Benoit. And just on the face of it, it's fairly obvious that if he was genuine in that belief, it just really stems from the fact that he was, you know, a fundamentalist Christian, and he decided that, oh, well, this guy was a Satanist, so he must have done it. Just to sort of, you know, just nonsense really.
Entirely. And it'd be interesting to see, you know, if he had remained, a Klansman, would he even be saying this, you know? Again, I suggest the listeners go and watch Keelan's film because you go into more detail about that. But I just wanted to address those two quickly because those are the two big ones. Very, very quickly. Interesting though, you know, there are some other aspects of the case, not necessarily suggesting that there was something more to this. I do genuinely believe Benoit did this himself. He killed his wife and son and then took his own life. But there does seem to be some evidence suggesting that WWE knew about this before it was publicly known. That they might have actually, you know, you point to I believe it was one of his Benoit's neighbors who was told by the police. This is crazy. I didn't even know that they would do this. Yeah. No one has seen him for days. He's left these bizarre voicemails on two wrestler friends of his on their cell phones that don't make any sense, talking about the dogs being locked up by the pool. Very strange. And then the cops they report him. They report this to the police. The police in the local area tell his neighbor to go check on him, which seems insane. She then does check on them, finds the bodies, runs out screaming, and she states that she saw another wrestler in like just outside his house. So, you know, and that's never really been looked into. I believe his name is Dave Taylor. And, you know, you point out there are a few moments where it seems like the WWE might have known, or some people within the organization might have known what this was. Because we should keep in mind, there was a memorial service for Benoit live on television. Like that,
yeah,
you know.
So basically so on Sundays they have the big events, and then Monday they have the television show, Monday Night Raw. And they obviously realize by the Monday morning that, hang on, where is this guy? Something's gone wrong here. So they call the police and say, look, we need a welfare check on this guy. We're not sure what's going on. He said his family had food poisoning. We've had these weird text messages. Can you go check on him? And instead of the police doing it themselves, they asked the neighbor to just sort of go knock on the door and see what's happening. And she obviously goes and she discovers the bodies and is obviously freaked out. And on her way out of the property, she bumps into Dave Taylor, who at the time he was off the road from WWE, but he was still under contract. But he lived nearby basically. And he was walking up to the property with like a platter of deli foods. And the theory is, or at least this was put forth by someone who's been harsh on wrestling for decades, someone called Phil Mushnick. He puts forth the idea that WWE probably sensed that something bad had happened. And they obviously called the police to get it sorted out, but they wanted a pair of eyes there to sort of get all the information and get it straight back to them. And that's what Dave Taylor was doing. He's there with a platter of deli food. Maybe, he's his friend. He thinks they're sick. He's just turning up to say, look, are you guys all right? Here's some food. Hope everyone's doing okay. Look after yourselves, whatever. But they scheduled this memorial show on the Monday, showing his greatest hits, his matches, and they do this. WWE is bizarre. They always like to milk the emotion of even tragedy. Like they have all the wrestlers sort of on screen telling their
Like
stories
giving, like,
about Chris.
testimonials and
Yeah, like blubbering up and crying, and it's very bizarre. But it at some point, I think along that timeline, they realized something bad had happened and that Chris probably did this, and it probably got out that this was a double murder suicide. But they'd already put all the energy into having a memorial show, so they just went ahead with it anyway. And perhaps also because they don't want the negative publicity that would have come out if they sort of switched things up and said, oh, look, Chris killed everyone. We don't know what to do now. So they went ahead with that show. And as I said, yeah, a few of the wrestlers were on camera sort of giving their retrospective of Chris's career. And a lot of them were very like, oh, Chris was a great guy. I used to leave my kids with him. He was an awesome guy. But William Regal, who's another wrestler, he was quite close to Chris Benoit. He just wouldn't elaborate on everything. He was just like, he was a great wrestler, but I'm not going to comment anymore at this time. And I think if you think about it, there probably was a feeling that they knew what happened, but they went ahead with this anyway. So that's really the only sort of conspiracy theory. I mean, it's not really, it's not like someone else did it or anything, but there's just a bit of murky information there.
Mm. Well, and it's interesting too, this idea that they had, that maybe they knew that he had done this, that Chris Benoit had killed his wife and son and then killed himself. And, a lot of, in these close people, like, you point to William Regal as someone that was close with Benoit, who, was very cagey during this tribute. And it does make me wonder if, they didn't suspect something was off because, in the weeks leading up to this, his behavior had become increasingly erratic. And this is like from, members of his family, from his wife's family that, attested to this. And this seems to be a direct result of a degenerative brain disease that Benoit absolutely had. And I know that a lot of the media wanted to go to this whole roid rage thing. And again, without getting into the scientific details and the specifics of this, you can watch Keelan's documentary. There really is actually no evidence, really actually scientific evidence that roid rage even exists. And there's actually a lot of evidence to point that, taking testosterone actually mellows a lot of men. So, take that however you want. And I'll just say, as someone that is obsessed with cycling, professional cycling, back in the 80s and 90s and in the 2000s, every single cyclist was doping with testosterone. And they, and that's a huge, like, you could just look at that as a subset, as a whole thing where all these guys were taking human growth hormones, they're taking EPO, they're taking testosterone. They didn't all end up brutally murdering anyone, as far as I know so, you can take that as an example that, because I know that people kind of, the wrestlers, they're taking steroids, they're all buff, they go crazy, but roid rage doesn't really exist. There isn't any evidence that actually points to this. Whereas
I think if you look at the crime itself, roid rage, whatever it may or may not be, is a momentary snap of anger. It's my hormones are all out of whack. Something's annoyed me. I'm just going to punch the wall or something. This was a crime that spanned 3 days. There was a lot of sort of at least initial planning involved. Like Nancy was tied up. This wasn't he didn't just randomly attack her. Like she was tied up. He placed Bibles beside them. There was a sort of suicide note that was left where he'd written that he was depressed. He's planning to leave this earth, things like that. And it spanned 3 days. So that's not rage. That's not like he did all that in a fit of rage. That's something a bit more deeper psychologically, I think. So, like, regardless of whether roid rage is even real or not, it wasn't roid rage. That's just not what it was.
No, and conveniently, Fox News and others would obsessively talk about roid rage, for weeks on end after the murder happened. But they would never talk about the fact that Benoit also had Vicodin, Xanax, and alcohol in his body, from toxicology reports, which is definitely an extreme combo to be taking. On top of his traumatic brain injury. And let's talk about this, Keelan, because this is sort of like the heart of the film. I mean, where you really kind of break this down and you get past the media hype and you get into some actual scientific facts. Benoit's brain was studied afterwards by the Sports Legacy Institution. And, tell the listeners, what did they find when they examined Benoit's brain?
Yeah, so like you said, after he died, the group's called the Concussion Legacy Foundation now, but back then it was the Sports Legacy Institute. And, they took his brain out and they did extensive tests on it, and it showed the same sort of amount of degeneration as an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Now people have took that and sort of brushed it aside, like, oh, are you serious? An 85-year-old Alzheimer's? How did he get to the arena? How was he sort of talking to people? I think people are misunderstanding what they meant by that. They're not saying he had the exact same symptoms of a elderly Alzheimer's patient. They're just saying that his brain had deteriorated to a similar degree. It's a different condition, obviously. And CTE, it causes depression, causes mood swings, memory lapses, just all sorts of cognitive issues. And people say, how did he get to the arena? He actually was struggling with a lot of things. Nancy Benoit's sister said that, he was that paranoid and got into weird obsessive loops that he would sort of, if he'd go to the airport one way one week, he would have to go a different way the next week because he thought someone was following him, and he would plan out all these sort of detailed routes of how he would get to the airport, and he would do the same going to the gym and stuff. So that there's clear signs there that he was just not functioning properly. And he'd previously confided in the founder of the Sports Legacy Institute, Chris Nowinski, who himself was a wrestler who had to retire. He retired of his own accord. If he wanted to carry on, they would have let him. But he retired of his own accord because he was having these post-concussion symptoms. And he talked to Benoit, and Benoit said, look, I'm missing this chunk of time. I'm having memory problems. And I mentioned earlier that he had a suicide note that mentioned a lot of this kind of depression and issues. So, it's apparent that he was sort of on a downward spiral. And I think his closest friends have sort of confirmed that. And as I say, Nancy Benoit's sister. It's not too far of a stretch to imagine that this was a large contributor to what happened. It's a horrible, horrible tragedy, but he was suffering from some pretty messed up stuff.
Well, we should point out too that and CTE, for people who don't know, is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I can't pronounce it.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, but this is CTE is a big one that we see here in America in the NFL. We see, the whole CTE problem has become somewhat more noticed, spoken about. And this, comes from concussions. And you cite a few, NFL stars who did, exactly what Benoit did. Killed a loved one and then killed themselves. That's not isolated either. People suffering from CTE can act out like this. And there's a couple of high-profile cases. I can't remember the player's name off the top of my head, but I think he played for Kansas City and murdered his girlfriend and then drove to the stadium and shot himself in his car. There was jump in.
Yeah, and there was this other guy, I think his name was Justin Strelzek, who basically had a full sort of schizophrenic breakdown, thought he was hearing devil voices, went on just a high-speed random drive up the highway and went headfirst into a lorry and died. So, these things, have sort of started to show themselves in all sorts of different sports where concussions are a common thing. And I think it's interesting, like in this country we have rugby and there's none of this. And it's because in American football, they're all geared up and padded and they've got their helmets on. But that's just kind of a superficial, it looks like they're protected, but they're really not. They're going full pelt head first into each other and rattling their brains around. And it's kind of funny that in sports where you have less protection, you're obviously less likely to go full pelt and they don't actually have these problems. But yeah, like it's become a pretty well established thing now in the NFL that CTE is a major problem. And even just not always, there's a lot of suicide. Suicide seems to be the main thing. There was a wrestler called Andrew Martin who wrestled as Test. He overdosed on prescription drugs and they studied his brain and he had CTE. And now a lot of wrestlers have pledged to sort of donate their brains to science so they can study this. But yeah, just a lot of incidents can be traced back to CTE. Even football players that retire and they turn to gambling or they just have meltdowns in other ways, maybe that's part of it too.
Oh yeah, there was I think there was another football player you mentioned in the documentary who I believe before in his suicide note he said he wanted his brain to be studied because he knew there was something wrong stemming from massive concussions. Because I mean the big problem or something that really exacerbates CTE or that can cause that is also these guys are getting concussions, be it, in an NFL game or in the wrestling ring, and they continue fighting or playing. They're not, there's no like again, I mean, and anyone that's seen any kind of professional wrestling, I mean, these dudes are taking, metal chairs to the face. They're jumping off, huge platforms head first. They're slamming into things. There's no like doctor on the side saying, "Oh, well, hold on, let's just do a concussion check." I mean, they've begun to implement those in the NFL. But even that, I have my questions about how accurate that is or how much they're really doing. I mean, again, it's also like if the player seems, more or less okay, I think they will let him go on,
Well, that's always been the funny thing in wrestling. It's a show. It's not real. They're not intentionally trying to hurt each other and,
right.
The outcome's predetermined. But actually, traditionally, I mean, it's a bit different now, but historically, if you got hurt seriously in a pro wrestling match, you carried on and pretended that you weren't hurt. Whereas in like other contact sports, that's the end of it. So,
yeah, exactly.
It's
like
kind of ironic.
Yeah. No, it's like you're saying, I mean, if right, exactly. If this was rugby, let's say, and, your arm is broken, you don't keep going. Whereas in professional wrestling, no, play through the pain. Just bite your lip and, carry on, say your lines, and then walk off. Which is crazy.
And Chris Benoit was of a generation where they were on the road 300 days a year, performing every single night. And it was almost a sort of a badge of honor to work hurt and work through the pain and show that you're loyal and you can do it. And also Benoit, he was a smaller guy in the wrestling business. And a lot of those smaller guys that didn't get the attention on them because they just looked giant and they had a cool catchphrase and they looked like a superstar. A lot of those guys that never found their way into the main event, their whole thing became, well, I'm going to leave 110% in the ring. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to make it seem as brutal as possible. And that was their way of getting noticed. And he kind of came up through that era where that's what you had to do. You really had to sort of push yourself to limits that no one should really have to go to get noticed. And eventually, towards the end of his career, he was given the world title. He was put in the main event picture. And it was rewarding him for that style of wrestling that really is what caused his downfall.
And Keelan, I mean, I mentioned before that perhaps some within the WWE recognized that there was something off. I mean, do you have anything to add in terms of that? I mean, were there? Probably they wouldn't let us know. I mean, this is such a massive. I mean, it's like $1 billion industry now. They're huge. The merchandise alone probably makes them a small fortune. But I mean, was it because I know that to some extent with the NFL, they were aware of this. There were people saying, these guys something is happening to these guys' brains. The concussions are having a really negative, long-lasting effect. And the NFL was basically tried to hush it up. Is there any evidence that the WWE was aware of this? I mean, because they were definitely aware of the drug use that was going on. And, a lot of these guys were hooked on painkillers because they truly were in an insane amount of pain. But other things, too. I mean, you had guys abusing coke, definitely alcohol. I mean, was there any evidence that they were aware of things like CTE?
I don't think to the degree that we know now in terms of like the raw science of it, but I think, there's an element of common sense there. Like you get hit in the head with a metal chair, and you're in pain and you've got a headache and you feel like you want to throw up and you're going to another town and you're doing it all again. Like, I think it was just sort of, we're just going to brush this under the rug. I mean, there's no evidence that they knew the extent of the damage that was being done necessarily, but I don't think you can deny. No, everyone knows not to like run your head into a set of metal stairs or whatever. So, I mean, there's been a lot of lawsuits since all this came out of wrestlers kind of claiming, look, I had concussions, they made me wrestle, all this kind of thing, but none of them have ever stuck because there's no hard evidence that, as a policy, they were forcing these guys to wrestle when they knew that they had a CTE. I mean, no one really knew what CTE was, so none of that's ever really stuck. But, I mean, Vince McMahon knew that a lot of these guys were in pain, were on downward spirals. I think he just left it until he had to deal with it. That's kind of been his thing the whole time. Even recently, I mean, they're doing this thing now called the Women's Revolution, where, in prior years, prior decades, the whole point of women on wrestling was just to, eye candy. Yeah. And now they're letting the actual talented female wrestlers actually wrestle, and they're kind of hyping that. But again, it's just WWE going which way the wind blows. They'll just do what they can get away with, and they'll just market what's marketable, I think. So as much as there has been a lot of changes for the better, I think it's really just because they were forced to, not because that's what they wanted to do, if you know what I mean.
Mm. Oh, yeah. I mean, McMahon seems really just driven almost exclusively by money. And that's why he, buys up any and all competition to the WWE. I think, he, I'm not trying to knock his, business prowess, because I mean he certainly is quite savvy, and obviously he gets people to watch over and over. I mean nobody buys pay-per-view anymore except for wrestling and to a lesser extent boxing, in UFC. But he's people will still shell out a considerable amount of money to watch these things. So, I mean, he obviously, he has this product that people want. But yeah, I mean, it seems like, very much like he will just sort of push it, until you have to do something. Which seems to be, like the thing with Benoit. And then, like you said, I mean, talk a little bit about some of the reforms that they've put into place in the aftermath of the Benoit case.
Yeah, so they did have the drug testing shortly before Benoit did all this, because another wrestler, high-profile wrestler, Eddie Guerrero, died. He had a heart attack, and that was basically linked to past steroid abuse because his heart enlarged, which is what, it's a muscle too, so you enlarge everything basically in the end if you abuse steroids for a long period of time. And he also took a lot of painkillers in his day, which also sort of put stress on the heart. He was clean when he died, but, he had a heart attack young. And so they put drug testing in place, but it was always like, are they really doing it or whatever? Then this Benoit thing happens, and you get the sense that, maybe this thing wasn't legitimate. Maybe they weren't really testing them. So they did put in a pretty stringent, complete wellness policy. They test their cardio health. They're drug tested, all forms of drugs, even for a while. Marijuana was on that list. Now that they've lapsed that a little bit. But they've also introduced like proper concussion testing now. If they get a concussion now, they're off until they've passed tests and they can come back, and that can be weeks, that can be months. One wrestler called Daniel Bryan essentially retired. He came back now, but it's been like a number of years. So they are kind of taking that seriously. But still, they're still on the road. They still barely have any time off. It's still a very, very physical sport, and I think, physical show. And I think now the style is starting to morph into sort of a more athletic and physical style, because a lot of the younger, more athletic guys are getting their way to the top of the industry. So I wonder whether that will come back to bite them in the future. But like in terms of the testing, it's fairly stringent at the moment. But again, they still don't really get that time off that they need, and they could easily do an off season. They've got thousands and thousands of hours of content that they could throw out there. They don't need to have all these guys on the road for this long.
No, I agree, and I'll link this back in an odd way again to cycling, because the cycling season is almost a year long. I mean, for a lot of these guys, it can start as early as January. It'll end sometime in late October, and then it'll start up again in January. The cycling season has become more and more just insane in terms of how many races there are, and and in a similar way, cyclists are very the same thing, play through the pain all the time. I mean, these guys will. You'll see a guy finish a stage in the Tour or the Giro with broken collarbone, blood everywhere, and then they'll get out the next day and race again and again and again. And the same thing with they are now implementing concussion testing to a degree within cycling, but it's not like in the moment. If a guy has a horrific crash and seems a little bit like wobbly, you'll see them like they'll have a horrifying crash. They'll be stumbling on their feet, but then they get back up on the bike and they finish the stage. And sometimes it might be 4 or 5 hours later, when the stage is done and they get out of the press area and back to the team bus, that they're actually getting a concussion test. And it seems like at that point the damage has got to be done. I mean it's difficult, I guess, in a sport like cycling where you just have to keep going in a race, and also in something like wrestling where it's like they can't break the fourth wall and be like, wait, hold on. I don't know. It's scary because I think there's also going to be a generation. I mean, Benoit might have been a bit early, and I'd like to get your take on this, Keelan, but a generation of athletes, entertainers that are really going to be suffering from CTE in ways that we haven't really fully understood. I mean, we've seen bits and pieces here and there within the NFL and also within wrestling, but I mean, there's a lot of other sports where you're getting hit in the head more than you'd think. And even if you're wearing a helmet or something, it's not doing that much. I mean, what do you think in terms of the legacy of the sort of brain injuries? Because again, I mean, listen, it gets talked about in the NFL. They say we're doing concussion testing. Nobody cares. Now it's oh my God, they're kneeling. Or Colin Kaepernick's a Marxist or something. Whereas no one is really looking at the long-term health effects. I mean, what do you think, Keelan?
I think it's definitely going to take maybe another decade or so, but I think it probably is moving in the right direction. Like I said, there's a lot of wrestlers now. I'm not too sure how the NFL does all this, but there's been a ton of wrestlers that have signed up to donate their brains to science. So eventually the data is just going to keep adding up. And I mean, you mentioned there about different contact sports, even just children playing soccer and heading the ball.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even that's come out as being dangerous to the brain, because obviously that ball is not light. It's just thing whacking you in the head, and you've got kids doing that. So, you know, there's been sort of small campaigns to try and eradicate heading the ball until you're a certain age and things like that. So I think gradually these things are going to be put into place. But I also think we're probably going to reach a point where we just have to say any kind of contact sport is going to cause some damage. Are we okay with that or aren't we? You know, we're just going to have to make that decision. Perhaps retire a lot earlier or something of that nature. But I don't think there's any way of getting around it that all these sports do damage, and maybe that comes down to a parenting thing. I don't know, but it's something that society will have to face in the next decade or so.
No, and it is. I know. I mean, there's a. I don't know if you've seen the South Park episode with Sarcastoball. You know, where all of these fears of head injury and stuff. But I mean, it is real. Yeah, I know it's I've heard about the whole thing with soccer. I mean, again, too, a little tiny kid playing soccer. I mean, their brain just isn't developed. Their heads are softer than, you know, like maybe a grown adult. And this is like, you know, I don't know, maybe a little bit comical, but you know, Curly from the Three Stooges. He really did. He suffered severe head injuries from getting bonked on the head all the time. That did eventually, you know, lead. He had serious health problems later in life, but you know, he suffered from these like kind of long-term concussion problems where he had terrible headaches all the time. You know, he had a bunch of other health issues, but even something like that where it's like it's a movie. You know, it's not supposed to be real. No, they really were hitting him in the head all the time. And, you know, he suffered for it. And it's, I don't know, it's an odd topic. Like you said, I mean, are we gonna say, it's fine to get concussions, you know, like in every contact sport? I mean, is that just something we're gonna live with? I mean, that's a crazy, it's a crazy notion, but at the same time, I mean, sport is, I mean, especially where you are, Keelan, I mean, in the UK, I mean, they're not going to just stop playing soccer, you know, or something, you know, if something comes out that, oh my God, you know, every time a ball hits your head, you know, I don't know, you lose so-and-so amount of like brain capacity or something. I mean, these are massive industries that are not going to end. But yeah, I don't know, there's a weird moral quandary. I've actually, aside from like all of the like just I hate the NFL for a variety of reasons, the concussion thing has actually made it more and more to the point I don't watch it at all. But that's really what's like keeping me from ever watching it again is like knowing that when these guys are getting slammed in the head, it's like they could be, you know, a few more concussions away from committing something like Chris Benoit did. And I
mean, I watch wrestling now, and at least WWE have toned down their style a bit in terms of like weapons and stuff like that. And sometimes I'm sitting there thinking, oh, this is boring. But then I'm like, well, actually, no, like maybe I don't want to see someone get hit with a chair. So yeah, it's a conundrum, you know, as fans, we pay for this kind of thing to carry on, but you know, do we take some blame in that? I don't really know.
Oh, well, I think that's even a question that you posed in the end of the film is, you know, how much is this also the fans want more and more violence? And there are like different, you know, there's like these smaller independent wrestling leagues around the United States that like pride themselves on being even more extreme. I mean, that's its own little niche industry where these guys are really, I mean, doing horrific things to one another in the ring, and it gets legal. But anyway, I want to thank my guest, Keelan Balderson. You can go to wideshut.co.uk to find more of his work. And I want everyone to stay tuned. We're going to be speaking with Daniel Kovalik.